I'm a global macro investor betting how the world's going to go. 1971, the United States had paper bills that were like checks in a checkbook. They didn't have any value. But what they would do is they'd get you gold. Because the U.S. wrote more checks than it had gold in the bank, the gold was going down. And on August 15th, 1971, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And I watched Nixon said, they're not going to get you gold. So it defaulted. And I went on the floor of the stock exchange and I said, wow, this is a crisis. And I thought it would go down on the stock market, and it went up a lot. And so I researched it, and I found that on March 5th, 1933, the exact same thing happened. Roosevelt announced that they were not going to get the gold and that they would go off that and that they would print a lot of money. And they printed a lot of money. And what I realized at that time, and saw many times since, that anything that surprised me may not have happened in my lifetime, but happened before. I studied the Great Depression. Because I did that, I was able to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. We made a lot of money in the financial crisis because I understood what happened in the Great Depression. So in this case, three big things are happening that never happened before in our lifetimes. And the last time they happened was in the 1930 to 45 period. And those three things are the creation of a lot of printing of money to pay for the debts. We needed to at the time, but it was very overdone. We actually sent out checks which were about 5 times as much as the amount that would have compensated people for their losses. Where'd they get the money from? The government borrowed the money. Who did they borrow the money from? The Federal Reserve. What they did is the Federal Reserve prints the money and they buy the debt. And that's how it works. So now everybody gets all these checks and everybody's happy because they get all these checks. But when they get all this money and then they spend it, everybody's surprised they got inflation. We've increased the amount of money by 25% or more. What has happened? The price of anything is equal to the amount of money and credit spent on it divided by the quantity of it sold. And so when you increase the amount of money and credit, buying power, spending, by a lot more than you increase the quantity, you get inflation. What happened in both of those cases is they hit zero interest rates. So I can't lower the price of money. So what do? Number two is the amount of internal conflict that's going on in the United States. The size of the wealth gaps, the size of the political conflicts is the greatest since not only the 30 to 45 period, it's much greater than that, 1900. You have to go back to 1900 to have that conflict. We're having a form of a civil war where populism is one side in a battle with the other side that won't accept losing. That's why in the next elections, there's a good chance that neither side will accept the result and accept losing. History shows that when the causes people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. Right now, there's not much agreement and the polarity is becoming greater. The political right now, if you follow politics, if you even watch events like, what will the reaction be to Supreme Court making the decision of Roe versus Wade? Why are moderates in the political system choosing not to run for re-election? We have this internal conflict that is actually threatening rule of law and the adherence to the Constitution. It's entirely possible that people with different views, they will go to different places and they will fight. So that degree has never happened in my lifetime before. I was born in 1949. 1945 was when the New World Order began. These world orders happen because there's a conflict and then somebody wins. So that brings me to the third thing that's happening, which is the rise of a great power to be comparable, China, and with it, Russia, and they form alliances, right? There's the Allied powers and the Axis powers, two different sides, kind of, and then they're competing. Because what happens is when you have a new world order, the winners of the war get to set the rules. So in 1945, America won, and it was the richest country in the world. It had 80% of the world's gold, and gold was money, and it had 50% of the world's economy, and it had a monopoly on military power. And so it set the rules, and that's why the UN is in New York and the World Bank and IMF are in Washington, D.C. It set the rules. So that's changing. There are certain things that we're doing. We're spending a lot more than we're earning. We're living off the printing presses. We're letting the infrastructure go. We're giving our next generation debts. We're not educating all children well. And we have a world order battle. There is an allied and axis power kind of thing that is emerging. There's certainly a competition. There are 5 different kinds of wars. There's a trade war. There's a technology war. There is a geopolitical influence war. There's a capital war, and there could be a military war. There is a military war now in Europe with Russia, and those are the patterns of history. And there's only one way to do well, and that is to be strong in all those ways. So I'm very bipartisan. I believe the opposite of the polarity, the extremes of the left or the right. I pray for the middle and bipartisanship to find ways. I've watched the process evolve in the cycle. So what happens is you have the war, you have the new rules. Wars are sort of great equalizers, and then you come back. And then you have a period of peace and prosperity. You have peace because nobody wants to fight the dominant power, and you have more equal people, and then they have prosperity. But the way the system works is over a period of time, that creates differences in wealth. And that's fine. You provide capital, that's the capital system. People with great ideas come along and they're productive and inventive and they produce great things and so on. But as they obtain the greater wealth, they also obtain greater benefits, like they could educate their children better. And if you're poor, you don't get to educate your children better. And so the polarity increases and it becomes unfair because, we all should have like equal opportunity. And then you also build up a lot of debt. Here's the irony of it. As these cycles begin at their later stages, the rich are the ones who get into debt. Now, you would think it's exactly the opposite. It's easier to have a good living standard and save. But like the United States, when per capita income was 40 times that in China, it started to borrow from China because they have a big saving mentality. When you have a poor person who doesn't have much, they want to save. Their saving is in our currency because when they think, how do I save in world currency? I'm going to buy dollar-denominated debt and I'm going to save in it when we borrow. And that's been the case. We didn't experience what our prior generations experienced. I know my dad went through World War II. He went through depression and war. His mentality is very different in terms of, what you take for granted or how you save. And that creates a cycle. One man's debts are somebody else's assets. The world right now is holding a lot of money in debt instruments. It could be money market funds, it could be bond funds. And we were in an environment in which bonds went up for 40 years and everybody's comfortable. And there wasn't an inflation pressure. And so everybody thinks that cash is the safest place to be because they don't think about its buying power. And so what happens is you have to satisfy both the debtors and the creditors, which is difficult to do when you've got more. Okay, you got a lot of debt. Because if you pay that debt back in real money, in hard money, so the guy gets paid back the buying power that he lent, that is going to be really bad because you won't have enough money. So the easiest tax is to tax through the printing of money. That's because nobody asked where did the money come from. The checks came in and we're all happy. And we didn't take the money away from anybody, but you lose the buying power. So as you get the inflation for that, you get the behavior change. So still, you have to make a choice. Do you want to own that stuff or not? And so what happens is when you make that choice that you don't want to own it, you sell it. And so the amount of selling is not just the deficit. The government will have a deficit of 5 or 6% of GDP. It'll have to borrow. So that means it sells bonds or sells debt of 5 or 6% of GDP. But if others sell too, because they say, I'm not getting a real return, I'm not going to hold that, then you have a lot of selling. That means that either interest rates go up a lot and shut the thing down, or the government prints more money. And that's the mechanics. History's shown us, chapter 3, I think it is, called The Value of Money. And 100% of the time when they're in that position, they'll print the money. Here's the big thing that people think. Money and financial assets are not wealth. They're claims on wealth, but they're worthless. It has no value. It's not real. It's just like digital. It only has wealth, real wealth, if you sell it and you go buy something. It works as long as people who are holding those financial assets want to keep holding those financial assets, even though they're losing buying power to them. It's a Ponzi scheme. That's why if you look at history, even in the Old Testament, there was this idea of the year of Jubilee. What it meant is, okay, you always have these financial obligations rising relative to the other. It happened so often that they said, okay, let's just plan on it. Every 50 years, we're going to have to wipe it clean. Old Testament in the Bible, Okay. And they said every year we're going to have to do it. And then it was a system actually where they would say, now that you know it's going to be wiped out in 50 years, you will operate as though it will wipe out in 50 years. And therefore you won't have the Ponzi scheme as much. But that is how the Ponzi scheme has always worked, right? So that's what it is. Now you have a choice. You can hold those things, but then as they start having bad returns and you're holding them, what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with that? I want to be first out, but that's why you can be writer. You can be writer if you go through the jungle like I'm describing with people that see things that you can't see and you're open-minded, you can be writer. That's why I say that the key to success is much more in knowing how to deal with what you don't know than anything you know. There are two things. First was interconnected and therefore safer. That was the theory prior to World War II because they would marry each other. Royalty would be married and everybody's in the same family. There's no evidence either in the actions that are being taken or in history. Even members of the same family can kill each other. They can be so entwined in the same family that they gives them plenty to fight about. The second one in that dynamic is it depends on both countries. Do you have a win-win relationship or do you have a lose-lose relationship? The problems with China have a history. There was one thing under Obama, then there was a tilt and it changed to Trump. And they're now at the point where it's almost irreconcilable differences and each side is worried that the other side could kill it. In the book, I described the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is, let's imagine that there are two people and the best thing you could do is cooperate, but you don't know whether the other is going to cooperate or kill you. What should you do? You should kill the other one because otherwise there's some risk that they kill you and survival matters and it's tough to get to cooperation. And so we're kind of in that situation now. China is essentially in the enviable position of finding out how a war goes. And so because the NATO countries and Russia and Ukraine are in its type of war, you can see how that goes. You can see, for example, that the US brings out its big weapon is sanctions. By the way, sanctions have always in history been the big weapon that's brought out before the big military weapon. Like in World War II, Japan was expanding in Asia and the United States imposed sanctions. They sort of embargoed the oil, made it more difficult for them to get oil, and they froze their assets. And so they were stuck, and then they reacted and they bombed Pearl Harbor. And then we had World War II. I've been going to China since 1984, not for money, but for interest, because if I can find interesting places with interesting people and see it through their eyes, I can do that. And I was able to help them learn about the financial markets and so on. And that's led me to know the leaders there, as well as lots of poor people, and to see it through their eyes. And I would say they do not want a war. So we have something that's very similar to that. Now, when I look at the situation there, I think there are three big questions that we don't yet have the answers to. The first question is who wins in the UK-NATO war, essentially. Does Putin win or does the West win? And here's what winning looks like for Putin. That he controls the eastern part of the Ukraine without being regularly threatened. That the economy in Russia has something like a 12% downturn, but is tolerable. Now, since Russia imports everything, you could actually totally shut them off. But how much will those sanctions crush Russia, or will it be tolerable? They are so used to suffering that they're almost uncomfortable if they're not suffering. If you go back 1917, they had the revolution, they lose World War II, they lose 30 million people. Then Stalin comes in, then they lose another 30 million people. You know, it's that kind of thing. They have communism, then they have a bankruptcy, and the whole thing collapses in 89. So they won't trade off that issue generally for a 12% fall in GDP. I would say the odds of that are very, very, very small because of a variety of things in terms of security and other things. We'll see. But if he loses, and he appears to be losing, I think he'll escalate. In other words, I don't think he'll go out quiet. And so if he loses, I think that you will see escalation, and that'll take the form of probably threatening nuclear. And also it's a very dangerous thing. And we'll see what the power of sanctions are. And then the third thing we'll see is how the sides line up. West and East You could look at the countries right now and you could look at their actions and you could see which side they're lining up. Do they abide by the sanctions? Do they not abide by the sanctions? So the beginning of the picture of which are the allied countries and which are the access countries, like in World War II, there's a European war and there's an Asian war and different countries line up, but by and large, they're consistent. And so we're beginning to see those things. Only in Europe. It's so interesting. And I could rattle the countries off. India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, China, almost half the world has taken either the other side or has said, I'm not going to participate. Don't make the mistake of just looking at the European NATO countries. So anyway, China can watch that and how that works and learn a lot. The world has now changed to a whole different dynamic in which ideologies rule, fight and rule. For example, think about it this way. The person who makes decisions for Twitter will have a bigger effect on our lives and choices than the Supreme Court's decisions. In other words, I could do it this way or I could do it that way. The system we used to be in was a fairly open system in which economics would rule. If you made more money, you got more resources, and resources were allocated by that. That's much less the case now. Now ideologies are taking control. So for example, DeSantis, governor of Florida, and Disney. The ideology that you have and that I will fight for it and I will use all the resources I have is the determiner. And in some extent, it almost needs to, like in some respects, what's going to get money to the kids in schools that we're talking about. But that notion that if the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. Because that system of how do we work these things out together becomes a power thing. I don't think you're going to see either side giving up, losing. We played by the game, playing cricket or something, and then we go off the field. That was amazing that we did that for so long. But I don't think that you're going to do that as much because it's a win at all cost game. And I think that you're going to have this pervasively within the United States. So you get more nationalism. You're going to have more nationalism. Why? Because I need self-sufficiency and that other country might be an enemy. And then you go within a country and you see the same thing within a country. I need to fight for what I believe. So we are now in a fight for what you believe type of environment that will determine things. And we're just not used to it, but that's what's happening. So can we be good with each other? If we could just be good with each other and not fight and be afraid of fighting, have the middle work together and so on. Let the extremists who are fighting calm down. Like if I was president, I would have a bipartisan cabinet because politics now, it's like one side beats the other. On the statistics, roughly speaking, 30% of the population is extreme right by measures such as, there's a range of things. What percentage of the Republicans or Democrats think that members of the other party should die? It's 15 and 10. What percentage would not want their child to marry the member of the other party? What percentage of those think the election was stolen? If you start to use those numbers, roughly 30% is, by my measure, probably pretty extreme right. And because of that, that's the majority of the Republican Party has to have unified. Maybe it's 25, maybe it's 30, I don't know. But we know how the Republican Party largely is being influenced by Trump. The parties are fighting within each other, and the moderates are dropping out. Not so much they can't finance, it's because of the way politics is. It's brutal and it's lies. Yeah. You can only win if you are one of those extremes that win the primary because they're in that war. So now you hear that I agree that the majority is in the middle, but there is a dynamic here. That's why, like if I was president, I'd want a bipartisan cabinet, or I want whatever it is that's going to bring, compromise the middle, us together. Like I believe the president of the United States should be the president for the majority of the people, not in a war of one against the other. That's why I think the president, they should have the equivalent of the Manhattan Project with moderates from both parties, work together to re-engineer this and agree on it. And everybody's so hung up, it's got to be exactly the way they want, that you get nothing. Look, I don't care what they agree to. If you have smart people from both sides and they come up with a program, I'm almost certain it's going to be much better than what we've got. I think there's a systemic problem, by the way, in terms of the way capitalism works that needs to be adjusted because the profit system and the reward system doesn't accomplish all the goals that we need to have accomplished. In other words, do we have broad-based prosperity and opportunity? So there are certain adjustments that could be made to that to make it work better. The right, the capitalists, know better how to increase the size of the pie, but they don't know how to divide the pie. And the left knows how to divide the pie, but they don't know how to increase the size of the pie by being more productive. They both can happen simultaneously.
Okay, there we go.
Like an investment in good education. I'm just giving one good example. Invest in good education. Have an acceptable bottom so that the kids don't become those adults. You know, I'm in Connecticut, $600 million a year is spent on incarceration because the kids grow up in these households and the kids have a problem walking to school because they have to pass through neighborhoods where there are gangs and shootings. Why can't you have the police assure safe passage? Well, they can only afford 275 police because it either has to come out of that or the food or whatever it is. But I had two parents who cared for me, loved me. I went to a public school and I came out and there was equal opportunity. That's all you need, or at least one parent. And then if you got one parent, it's very difficult. And if you don't provide that, then you're going to have children who are going to be so disadvantaged that rather than assets, they'll become liabilities. And it's so unfair. So you can go back and you could see, I can go back and study all these empires. And it's a basic thing because you don't know where the talented person's going to come from. It can come from any part of the population. And so you get more resources of creative people that way. You get less liabilities in it, so it makes sense for the system, and it's fairer and so on. But we don't do that. I have to be objective, and the only way I can do that is have objective measurements. In that book, you see the measurements. So you can look at where we are in education relative to the rest of the world, where we are in infrastructure, and you could see that change. And you could see how the United States is in relationship. So you can see those things objectively. And yes, of course, it's common sense. If you educate your people and they are more civil with each other and you provide equal opportunity, the system will work better. The capitalist system is a remarkable, fabulous system. But when it produces the big inequalities of opportunity and productivity, yes, we could make good investments and infrastructure. When this went down and they have school, the kids didn't have computers and they didn't have connectivity. That's like not having electricity. How can we have that? So what we had to do, we do it philanthropically, but it's not enough. And so there's capitalism that can increase productivity. You can increase the size of the pie and you can distribute it well. There are things you can do. Success has to do, most importantly, with how you handle what you don't know rather than what you do know. And that how you get it from other people is the most important thing, right? And how you orchestrate those people. It's not like one guy sitting there knowing it all and dictating how it should go. But it's the opposite. Everybody makes mistakes and everybody's got a lot of weaknesses. And knowing how to deal with that well, you learn more from mistakes, right? Because it produces pain and pain says don't do that again or figure out another way of doing it. And then mistakes, it's part of the process of learning. And we have weaknesses. You can't think all different which ways and you can't have enough info. That's just a reality. But that's right. I think a lot of people think that the people who've been successful are different than they really are. So I started my company in 1975. And in 1980, 81, I just had a few people working for me. And I had calculated that American banks had lent more money to foreign countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that they were going to default, and that was going to create a big debt crisis that would create a big economic crisis. And I got a lot of attention for that because it was a very controversial point of view. And in August 1982, Mexico defaulted on its debts and a number of countries defaulted on their debts. And I thought we were going to have this big economic crisis. And I couldn't have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom in the stock market. I lost clients. I lost money myself. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to take care of family bills. Very, very painful. And yet it changed my way of thinking. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. First of all, it gave me the humility or fear of being wrong, but without me losing my audacity. In other words, I wanted to have the great upside, but upside goes with risk. So it forced me to sort of think about how I should be, which taught me a few things. First, it taught me to find the smartest people I could find who disagree with me to stress test my thinking and hear their points of view. It taught me a radical open-mindedness. It taught me that if I can diversify well, I could reduce my risks without reducing my returns. And it gave me an approach to life. Like I was in a position in which, okay, there's risk and returns. And it felt like on one side of a jungle, and that if I can cross this jungle, which is very dangerous, I could get to the other side and have a wonderful life. Or should I stay on the safe side of the jungle and not do that? And, of course, I had to cross the jungle, but how would I do that? And the way that I did it, I learned, was to find people who were on the same mission, who could see things that I couldn't see, and we could see together. And I loved going across through that jungle so much, essentially, that I don't want to leave the jungle. I just want to be in it with them doing this. That experience changed my life. I'm a global macro investor betting how the world's going to go. The upsides were a lot bigger than the downsides. And we've been doing that, for 47 years. And it was that painful experience. I learned a principle that is in my mind and has become a habit. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Because what it is a lot is habit, and you get your habit from cues. And so what seems to me now is if I have a painful experience, I view it as a puzzle, that if I solve the puzzle, which is, how does reality work and how would I deal with it better in the future, I will get a gem. And that gem is some principle, which I will literally write down and say, okay, now I'm going to do that thing in the future. So my habit has become different. Also, I accept my realities. Life gives you your reality. Some of them you don't like. It's just reality and you have to deal with your realities. That's the game. I lost a son, 42-year-old son. It was the most painful experience. I would rather have died. I would rather have lost everything that I had, and I lost them. And the reflection, the acceptance of the reality, the understanding reality, the feeling of it. I was 12 and I was caddying, and the stock market was hot at the time. And I'd caddy and I'd take my caddying money and I'd put it in stocks, and I was with him, and that got me hooked on the stock market. And it's so true that a lot of people I met, if you know Jack Dorsey's background and a lot of people's backgrounds at that early age, that's right around puberty. And you think differently pre-puberty than you think after puberty. You learn differently. And that experiences around that can have a very big effect. You can learn in a way that you can't learn later. And so, that was my experience. I got hooked. I didn't know what I was doing, but the only stock I bought a stock which was called Northeast Airlines. And it was the only company I ever heard of that was selling for less than $5 a share. And that was my investment. It was so dumb and lucky. And there's the pages in the Wall Street Journal. It's got all these names. And if I just find one of them, I can do well. So I figured, okay, I'm going to do it. And that's what got me hooked. You feel it. I think games are part of it. I have 3 sons now, and one of them is into education through gaming. That's why I like the conversation, because we also are into our games, and we can be too much into our own games and our own worlds. And you don't know about the other worlds and the other games. And that's really interesting to know about them. And you don't have to make it your full-time thing. I like to find the people who are the most different all around the world. I built relationships over decades doing that, and it brings you into different worlds. I love that. I'm hooked on that. Look, I never even tried to make money, meaning it became a game. And I always wanted enough money so that I could be free and that I could take care of my family and not worry and play my game. I think that people sometimes lose sight of what is money for. It has no intrinsic value. It can only get you things. So what is it that you want? What's it for? What makes you feel good? And if you lose touch with that, then you're kind of in a problem. So to me, success is having the life that you want to have, whatever that is, and having a little bit more than enough money to do that. Now, that can be with low spending. I watch a lot of people that I admire. They have backpacks. They go around the world. You can go anywhere. You can live in the most interesting places and the most interesting people. You can be in nature in the top of a mountain in a tent, and you can't get it more beautiful. You can have the most wonderful life without a lot of money. We're talking about a number of things that are mistaken beliefs about what people at, quote, the top. And how do you measure the top? Well, maybe it's money, maybe it's success or fame or whatever it is. And it's not like that. It can be on anything. You can develop an obsession. You have to be careful for the obsession. For me, it's meaningful work and meaningful relationship. Do you love your work and do you love your relationships? If you got those two things, when I have my encounters with reality and I reflect, I learn about how reality works and I write down principles for dealing with that type of situation. So I started to do it for investments, but I do it for every aspect of life. I want to pass along how the world is changing and how societies rise and decline and where we are in that cycle.